Thank you, Liz, for having me and everyone at the university, and thank you all for coming out today. It's always great to pop by and to the university here, and I'm really excited that I'm actually teaching for a little bit this semester. It's been a lot of fun. Tonight I was going to talk a lot about the housing industry, the housing economy, and housing in general. I always weave in a little bit about the Katrina Cottages and my work down in the Gulf Coast. But I reshuffled percentages a little bit, considering that today is the 7th anniversary of Katrina, and as we speak, Hurricane Isaac is sitting on top of New Orleans and the Gulf Coast, dropping a lot of water. So it seemed appropriate to dial up the percentage of the talk on the Gulf Coast. The interesting thing, these were images from what we ran into in 2005, coastal Mississippi and New Orleans. The interesting thing that happened there were two completely different storms. Katrina was completely different. In Mississippi, it was a storm surge that came and wiped the houses away. You can see just the debris of building. And that storm ended essentially the day of the storm. In New Orleans, it was the opposite, where the levees broke, and the water came in and sat there for a couple weeks. What's interesting, I haven't followed, because I've actually been here all day, I haven't followed exactly what's happening down in Louisiana now, but it sounds like with the flooding, with the water just dumping down, it's not a wind event, it will be a water event. So the lessons we learned on the New Orleans side will actually be very applicable to what's happening there. Well, what's really interesting, actually, in addition to the two types of storms, is how parallel the lessons we learned there can be applied to everything in the greater housing economy. When I moved on from working on the Gulf Coast, I went to the man-made disaster of disaster housing for everyday America. When the economy sort of imploded in 2008, we were left with another major housing crisis. It wasn't a storm that destroyed the homes, but the financial setup of how we structured the lending and how we ended up in the homes we ended up with, in addition to just the structure of where it was built, all of these sort of endless, winding little roads. And as I moved on to the man-made disaster of the economy and the housing industry, I realized that there were a lot of parallels. So you're going to see throughout this talk, I'm going to bounce back and forth a little bit between the big picture of housing everywhere and the specific of disaster housing. And in the end, we're actually going to see that the same solutions apply to both. And they're really universal. It's universal lessons that we can learn. I like this cartoon. It's sort of the American dream helper. It lists all the things you want. You can have your lifestyle, the house in the suburbs, the 2.5 kids in the minivan. Instead of just adding water, it's just add money. And we have built up our entire structure on, in some cases, money that just wasn't there, and in other cases, money we hoped that would come that isn't coming now. And it set up a structure of how, what, and where we build that was unsustainable. These three principles for the architecture students in the room, these are sort of based on the Vitruvian triad of firmness, commodity, and delight. Roughly translated to sort of modern language, performance, price, and preference. We lost that over the time. Vitruvius said that every building, must have these three things. It must have the firmness, meaning it must work. In sort of modern language, it must perform well. The commodity, the price, it has to work. You can have any one of these two things. You can have the delight, which is the sort of the preference for what it looks like. You can have any one of these two things easily. You can have a building that works perfectly well, but it could be really expensive, or it could just look awful, but it might work. And that's not a successful building. You can have a building that is really affordable, but it might look like barracks and not really work. The trick to designing a great building and building great communities is to merge these three. And as we look at the housing industry as it's happened, and when we look back at sort of how we rebuild after disasters, we find that the best way is to really try and balance these three things. How do you balance the firmness, commodity, and delight, and do it in a way that actually works today? And this goes back to what I just said, is the what, where, and how much. In the formulas that we're using to build in rebuild in some cases and build new in others. This is Anywhere USA. It's the tract housing that's just sort of popping up for the sake of popping up. These are the houses that they sell for square footage for the sake of square footage. In 2000, I think it was 2007, I met with a developer in Texas who told me he needed one thing to sell a building, and that one thing was a C of O. He just had to have it done. He didn't need a granite counter. He didn't need anything else. He literally needed to finish the house, and he was guaranteed that he would be able to make a sale. The wheres, this idea of driving long distances forever and ever, the drive till you qualify. For the longest time, if you could just afford a little bit more a little bit further out, then that was okay because gas was cheap and the money was basically free. Though that formula of building these big houses that really was a little bit more house, a little bit further away for a little bit more than you could afford, led us to the disaster we're in. And so we're starting to sort of regroup a little bit and reassess what it is that matters. And we're redefining in the process. Now, the interesting thing, and I'm going to sort of flip back now to this idea of the disaster housing, when we went down on the Gulf Coast afterwards, we were led by Andres Duani, who organized a charrette, a team of about 200 people. And he brought up I think the single point that really resonated through our entire planning session was that the things that were given the day before the storm, the things that were fixed that people really loved were actually illegal in some ways the day after the storm because of zoning codes, because of the way things have adapted. And what was interesting was it made everybody take a step back and really assess what mattered. It wasn't what a code was written, it wasn't how the things had been sort of evolving towards. It was a moment to say, and it was interesting because very rarely do you get a clean slate, and it's not an ideal situation, but it was an interesting sort of example to look at. What really matters? What are the things about your community? If your community was lost today, what are the things that would be important? And what are the things that you would actually, given the opportunity to change? The economy has done the same thing. We got to the point where what we were building was unsustainable. People have lost their homes, and now they're regrouping. Now they're getting the opportunity to say, what really matters? If you're investing in a house today, if you're purchasing a house, it's not guaranteed that it's going to appreciate. It's not guaranteed that you can sell it. It's not guaranteed that anything is going to turn into an ATM machine. So rather than your resale value, it becomes live-in value. And this becomes, I think, central to everything we do, everything we build, whether you're an architect or whether you're just interested in architect, everybody lives somewhere. And I think there's a unifying piece that whether we're rebuilding after disasters, whether we're dealing with the foreclosure, or whether you're just trying to figure out if you're living in the right place and maybe it's where you want to live now, but maybe it's not quite right for the next phase of your life, there's a unifying thing where now is the perfect time to sort of take a step back and say what actually matters. And overall, as we're seeing the sort of a major shift actually in what consumers are saying they want. They're not saying that the big things matter. They're actually saying what you touch and feel matters more. Standing on a porch or sitting on a porch and engaging with the parts of the house that matter become much more important than the many gables. When was the last time you sat on your gable and enjoyed a cup of coffee? It's not going to happen. But the money that you invested in that gable could be turned into a porch. And when you actually have to live in your home because you're not guaranteed to be able to resell it, then at that point, the where that money is spent really matters. We used to look at everything as everything was a consumable item down to the home. This big purchase, which was, to some degree, it used to be that the house was the largest purchase you would ever make. With zero down financing, it became something that it was one of the smallest purchases you'd ever make. It was just this thing, it was the equivalent of renting. But what we're seeing now is this complete shift, a shift to really valuing and having to really think about what we do and where we do it. And one of the points is it's not a great deal if you can't afford it. It becomes something that every dollar matters now. And whether we're looking at just housing anywhere or housing in an area where it has been destroyed, these themes start pulling through. So we're seeing a new consumer. And that consumer is, in a lot of cases, especially in the Miami market, it's somebody that has a lot of cash and able to put a large down payment. Over time, over the course of the next few years, that should ease up a little bit, but it won't go back to where it was. So now we will need bigger down payments. And that leads to a different type of housing. It means not everybody's going to live in a single family house. It means that, rentals become a viable solution for a lot of people that have lost their good credit. It also means that people are living in multi-generational families. So, the parents, rather than going off to sort of retire in the golf course community, might actually now share the house. And actually, the great thing about that is that it allows, you can have shared childcare, you can also share resources, and it actually ends up building community much more. And the interesting thing about whether it's the bad economy that we're speaking about or whether it's a disaster situation, another common thread is that they build community back because you have to make a deliberate choice on everything you do. And in a lot of cases, that choice is made with others, where we might not have done that in the past. We might not have, if everybody's off in their own individual home, we've never been more connected with all of our gadgets and everything else. We've also never been more disconnected than others. And the bad economy has actually shifted that, where we're seeing it, it's reasonable that actually people might want to live with a little accessory dwelling unit and have their parents out in the backyard because it makes sense. You can pool resources and you can be closer to family. It may not have been the first choice, but a lot of people are starting to do that. So this goes back to that changing consumer, changing what people are thinking about, how people are approaching where they live. So who, what, when, where, and why? In the end, the biggest market moving forward is going to be boomers and millennials, not just because of sort of economy-based things, but because they're changing life phase. The kids are graduating from college and moving out on their own. It used to be that those two demographics sat together in, sort of the hypothetical, they're at the end of the cul-de-sac in the big house. Now, those two groups have shifted. They're in different life phases, and we'll be looking for different types of places to live. And so that changes the makeup of everything we do. This default setting that we used to be on of just build that big house and it'll sell, that drive out a little further. Well, these two groups don't want to drive a little further. They actually want to walk to something after school or after work. They want to do something, they want to engage in community. So even if we hadn't seen the bad economy sort of make the lending practices sort of slow down that growth out, we would be seeing through the life phase people starting to pull back in. And it's fascinating to see because one of the things that when you start to really look at the development of cities, in a lot of cases the best time for those cities is usually in the worst economies. It's not when everything's moving really fast. It's not when everything's exciting and going. It's when things struggle, because that's when the tough decisions have to be made, and usually those decisions are much smarter. And so these groups are, when you combine those life phase and the economy, we're starting to see people make really smart decisions about how and what and where they live. We're starting to see also smaller homes. For the longest time, they were growing. Square footage is cheap. But now we're actually seeing smaller homes come in, which is great because like this image. This was the vision for the home computer in 1984. It's an illustration from, or you can actually include a steering wheel, and the architecture students will enjoy it. It looks some sort of plotter. This image was from 1950. In 1950, the average house size was 982 square feet. In 2004 and 2005, at the peak, the house size was pushing 2,600 square feet. So when we had the teeny tiny house, everything was huge. Now we have the huge house, and everything we have, well, this is the original cell phone, the old record player, and now what we have, everything is teeny tiny. So our housing and our needs of what goes in that housing has shifted completely. While one's getting larger, the other's getting smaller. So we don't actually need these big homes. They grew for the sake of growing. They grew when we didn't need them to grow, just because they could and just because it was free. So this is where another point where we can take a step back and say, all right, if we have the moment to stop, if we can pause, which we do because things are slowing down, what size do we really need? Do we need all of that square footage? Do we want all of that square footage? And luckily, in a lot of cases, people are starting to really look at and pay attention to what they're heating and cooling and realize that they don't need that large amount of space and that you can actually live really large in a much smaller space. Now, before we go on to talk about small, we have to start and really define what smaller spaces are. And this is where we start to go back to that idea of the Katrina Cottages, which I'm going to show in a little bit. But these, disaster housing and how you come in quickly and build something. It doesn't have to be huge to feel nice. Don't mistake size and scale. I like these two images. They're in New Orleans. They're 1 block apart. This is a brand new little modular house that was tucked back in. This is an old existing house. If you looked at the square footage of the two, this one is actually probably twice as large. They go the same distance in the lot. This one dwarfs a Hummer. And we were driving, I did not make that happen. I don't know anyone that drives a Hummer, but I made the person driving me stop, and I ran out and got this photo. The car is actually wider than the house, but the scale, because it has probably 14 or 16 foot ceilings, makes that huge car feel small. Yet when you look at this house, which if we're going to look at the square footage of the number, this house looks miniature. It literally looks like it's been taken to a Xerox machine and shrunk down from this house. So the number is meaningless. All square footage is not made equal. You could have two exact same size homes, and what comes up out of the ground is going to define how it feels, having nothing to do with the space that it actually is. So when we're talking about smaller homes, we're not talking about sort of living in a closet and the punitive, go away, this is this horrible thing. We're actually talking about redefining what square footage is at any scale, whether we're just small, a small teeny tiny Katrina cottage or just a family home. Another sort of question, looking at these, where's the small, where's the medium, where's the large of these homes? All of them are newly constructed. This is actually the largest house on this sheet, and these are the small ones, these are the mediums, and these are the larges. So what you perceive from the street has very little to do with the numbers and how it lives. I mean, you could take the exact same exercise, standing inside the space, taking a photo and saying, how big is this room? Because the numbers just don't matter. So when we're in those years of the building those bigger houses for the sake of building bigger houses, the square footage wasn't really being designed. It was just being put into it. And we're clinging to these numbers because they're numbers, but they really have nothing to do with how the space feels. And it was that principle that when looking at the bigger houses, that the Katrina Cottage came to be. So this is the original, the little 300 square foot Katrina Cottage. These were actually the drawings that came out of the charrette and the first one that we built. It was designed to be 300 square feet because at the time, the FEMA trailers were between 200 and 400 square feet. And the entire premise of this is everything that I was just talking about. It's this idea that what you touch and feel matters more than what reads on paper. And we don't need all of the bells and whistles, but what we do, we need to do really well. So we had an 8-foot porch on our, 8 foot deep, it was about 100 square feet, on our 300 square foot building, because we made it into a room. It became part of the house. And there were a lot of, after we did the original Katrina Cottage, there were a lot of the copycats that came out. And they would have a little 3-foot porch just to be able to say they had a porch. Well, at that point, it's not usable. It's not something that works. And it goes back to this idea of firmness, commodity, and delight. The firmness wasn't there, the performance wasn't there, it didn't work. It was a complete waste of money. And we see this on the big houses with the 20 gables, and we see this on the little houses that are just sort of pretending to look cutesy. If it doesn't work, it's money that is wasted. And in a time when there's not a lot of money to waste, it doesn't make sense. When money was free and it didn't matter at all, fine, do what you're gonna do. But when money really matters, then that's the point that we actually get better things. And that's why bad economies really are the best thing for good architecture. So this 300 square foot building, we built it at a trade show in Orlando. We actually built it in Mississippi, drove it to Orlando to show it, and it was an amazing thing. It was one of those things where all of the stars aligned. The space was given to us because Sarah Susanka, who actually I should have mentioned earlier when talking about smaller homes, she's an architect that did the Not So Big House series. She was going to do a model home, and it fell through at the last minute. Sarah's interesting, and for anybody sort of interested in smaller spaces, you should really study up on her, because she came up with the formula that when you figure out how much space you really need, that to live large the way you want it to live, you actually only need about 2/3 of the space you think you need. That 1/3 extra is completely wasted, and your house will live much larger than you think. The number becomes irrelevant. Sarah was going to do a show house, and at the last minute it fell through, and through different people, they actually came to Andreas and said, Andreas, we understand you were doing work down in Mississippi. Is there something that you would like to show? And he said, yes, we'd like to build Marianne's Katrina Cottage, which, at the time, and especially for the students in here, Liz asked me to talk a little bit about sort of how I got to where I am. And it was a lot of being in the right place at the right time and working really hard. And this was one of those in the right place at the right time moments, because Andreas just, sort of handed me the most amazing thing I'd literally just started my career at the time. When Katrina happened in Mississippi, I had actually only had my own firm for about 6 months, and I was invited down to be on the charrette. I designed this on the second day of the charrette, and then 6 months later this was built. And I took it and ran with it, but it was an amazing sort of sequence of events of just literally being in the right place and working hard and taking that and making opportunities out of it. So we proposed this, and FEMA liked it. Of course, FEMA couldn't build it because they didn't have the manual that told them how. And so they were actually very open to the idea. They actually created a pilot program which would allow us to create that binder for them. And eventually they now have it, so it'll be interesting, and I'm going to show you the results of those in a minute. It'll be interesting to see if that work can be applied to the new. I mean, that's really the test. Since specifically we have projects on the ground there now, it'll be very interesting to see if that's applied through. One of the things that we immediately looked at, and this is another case where the greater housing economy parallels the Katrina and what we learned. There are 4 ways if you want to build a house to get it there. I'm sure there are more, but I've sort of lumped it into 4 categories. You can take every stick there and every piece and build it on site. You can get a kit of parts that somebody has pre-assembled, but you have to build it. You can panelize the homes where you actually have walls, floors, and roof built in a factory and then assembled, or you could build the entire thing in a factory. We looked at all of them. This took too long, because we couldn't take all of the individual parts. So we focused our energies on these three. And what's interesting, in another parallel, this is where I'm focusing all of my energy now for new housing, because the economy, as it has affected so many in the, in the greater everybody, in the homeowners, it's also really affected the builders, and there are much fewer of them out there. There is still demand for homes. Lending is a problem, but there are new household formations. Houses are falling out of the housing stock. There will always be a need for new homes. What, where, and how we build them is in question, though. And that's why, I'm spending a lot of time right now for working on modular homes. The idea of the kit home is inspired by the Sears and Roebuck houses, where every single bit and piece was pre-cut and dropped off at the closest train station. There were the kit homes. The great thing about the kit homes, and we learned a lot from them, was that they were a variation on a theme. So this is a book, it's a little hard to read, but this is the original catalog image, and these are different variations of it built in different parts of the country. And we took from this idea that you can have an economy of scale, but you can also calibrate locally. And that was a piece that we really held on to. The other thing that we looked at a lot was this idea of cookie cutter and repeat. It's a very negative thing to say a house is a cookie cutter house. Well, this strip of houses in San Francisco is it's in the top 5, if not the highest, property value per square foot, and I apologize, I don't like the square foot, but per square foot of houses in the entire country. And if you look at them, they're all exactly the same. They're perfect. But the problem isn't repeating. The problem is repeating ugly things. And that's why people don't like cookie cutter houses. So we decided that we were going to repeat. We were just going to make it look nice. So this is what we were, at the time, with the Katrina Cottages looking at, is these, the little tin can trailers. The reason why FEMA did this was actually in reaction to what happened after Andrew in Miami, was that people were living in the houses too long. The trailers apparently delivered the larger park models, and people just got cozy in them and stayed. And they didn't want to rebuild. So FEMA decided, that's fine, we don't want that, so we're actually going to make them smaller, which in theory makes a little bit of sense, and you can see where they got there, but then they hadn't planned on Katrina, and now this resulted. There were great models for building little houses for disaster housing. This is in the 1908 San Francisco earthquake. And what's interesting is they're actually very cute little houses. These are restored. They sold them for $2 a month. I think the payments lasted, I think it cost like $50 or $100 for the whole house in the end. Over time, they actually became very valuable. This one was from 2007. It was $500,000, and it was added on to. But they cared enough. Can you imagine anyone adding on to a FEMA trailer? So we looked at this and said, we can build on this, and we can grow with this. And then we went, of course, the tricky thing was that we were in New Orleans, which had a very specific architecture. It wasn't anywhere USA. Most places you can actually have a vernacular, simple, architecture. Well, New Orleans was different. So we not only had to build buildings that would be easy and have the economy of scale, but we had to build buildings that were appropriate to the place. This is a house that I designed. This is one that DPZ designed, where we couldn't have the tall ceilings, but we could do as much as possible within our resources to create something that was appropriate for the place. And building on the idea of the Sears and Roebuck, variety within, this is all the same house. These two were built by FEMA. In the end, we built 250 houses through the FEMA program. This was built in partnership with Cottage Living for a family in Pass Christian, Mississippi. And you can see that they had more of a budget to work with. The editor actually that was doing the article designed that railing, and I think he built part of it. He went down and actually helped participate in it. But you can see the level of specification between these two houses is very different. But the bones of the house are the same, and it still, even in the more affordable one, feels like a nice house. And we were able, within this floor plan, we also had 3 different options. So you could have a 900 square foot house, you could have an 1,100 square foot house, or you could go up in the attic and it could be 1,800 square feet. So we had with a very set, limited number of variables, and then from that, we were able to calibrate, we were able to get the right size of things to make the houses appropriate for the place. These houses were built with panels, so it's steel frame panels, so they're not going anywhere. They're built in a factory, and then you can see they're a little bit heavy, but then the smaller ones you can just have 2 people doing. They could frame up a house, they sort of ship it out like a deck of cards. I mean, it's just all lined up. And they could have the frame of the house built in 2 days to have it completed. These are some of the houses being built. And it's interesting because what we were trying to do here is really applicable to housing now, because we still have this issue. You can't do a bunch of one-offs. So how do we build great places that aren't that sort of cookie cutter in a derogatory term, but cookie cutter in a way that builds great places? And we ended up doing 6 different floor plans. Each floor plan had a couple different variations so we could meet larger program, and then they also had different elevations so we could make them look interesting on the street. And in the end, because we weren't trying to, every house didn't have to reinvent the wheel, we were building buildings that created fabric. These are the exact same house plans built in 2 different places in Louisiana, and this is just outside of New Orleans, and this is up in Lake Charles. So it was the same thing. We just had these 6 plans that we kept repeating, and we did a play and plug. And I think there are a lot of models that we can use in this that we can then apply to the greater economy, because we were able to reach a pretty good economy of scale, and I think build communities that people will be quite proud to live in. The FEMA program was separated out into 2 states. We worked in Louisiana, and within Mississippi, they had their own program. They actually did trailers. And this is sort of the illustration of all the trailers in the staging area, very similar to the FEMA ones. When it comes down to it, there's only so much an architect or a designer can do. In the end, you're up against the realities of how things work. And whether it's a beautiful building or a trailer, it's gonna, you're gonna run into bureaucracy. You're gonna run into, there's only so much you can do. Hopefully, over time, we can sort of figure out how to get people in houses rather than stacking houses in fields. But when they eventually do get to the site, they can be, these modular ones are, they're beautiful. They can be really nice. They can build communities. These are smaller, so you can put them in outbuildings. And they can create great places. The, modular is not without its problems. And this is where, especially for the architecture students in the room, this is where your work will be really important, because you understand the difference. You're being trained the difference between this house, which is historic, and this. But if you talk to a lot of people, at a glance, they wouldn't know. They wouldn't realize that, that little bit of fence there, which defines the street, is much different than pushing this back behind a big fence. And, a city of these is a bit of a disaster. It is not this. It's a very different building in how it's sited, in how the details are put together. And it is possible to rebuild a great place or build great places new. It's just getting the details that matter. And that's why what you're learning here at UM is so important, because it's the little things with how a building is sited, how the porch trim works, that makes the difference. I think that ours, no one can do that. I can't say no one, but you cannot mass produce this at a big scale. Yes, you can reproduce it, but you can't mass produce it today in any sort of reality. But this is not acceptable in terms of mass producing either. And so the trick comes in finding somewhere in between. And this is where codes get in the way. See, here we see 2 similar homes. This one has this horrible parking requirement which pushes the rest of the house back. And it just becomes, this sort of caricature of something else. This is why people hate traditional architecture. This is why they look at this and say, oh, you can't build right like you used to. Let's build something else. This is what Tulane, their contribution to the rebuilding effort, was their sort of version of affordable housing, which was something like $200 a square foot. Incredibly expensive, took forever. The students apparently built it, and part of that was with the students building it. And so that can't be rebuilt either. So that is actually down the street from the last one. So those two houses, plus these sort of decrepit things, which hopefully somebody saved and fixed, because what the new contributions to New Orleans were not really much to be proud of, in terms of sort of a society. And that's where, what you're learning here is so important, because you can't, I'm sorry, but this is kind of phoning it in. It's not, a little of that's okay, but overall, to really build great places, and you can't talk about New Orleans without talking about Mr. Pitt, it takes more. Now, I like this image. This is actually one of the Lowe's Katrina Cottages. When we sold them through Lowe's, and we did not participate in any way. No one I know on the design team actually participated in that house, but we've looked at it. It is one of our designs, next to one of the Make It Right houses. And now, I would really like to sort of clean all of that, the stuff off of that house. The bones of it are good, but it sort of got a little ticky-tacky. But these sort of dark areas, arguably, actually, architecturally, this is much nicer. But what it does for the urbanism, what it does for the place, becomes a real problem when you have this complete hodgepodge of a little of this, a little of that, and it becomes actually, this is not going to be a nice street long term, because you're not going to feel safe walking by those dark areas, and the two together don't work very well. And so these are all questions that when we rebuild and as we rebuild and as we build new anywhere, they're all questions that we ask ourselves: is what is appropriate for place, and what is what works best. It's tricky. We can't recreate things that have been lost, but we can build appropriate for the economy, and we can build appropriate for things that are comfortable, where people can actually use the space as well. And that's what I think the most important thing, and especially especially the young students in this room, is as more of these disasters continue to happen, and they land on top of buildings that were not built well. In New Orleans, those buildings were actually designed in some cases to take water, but disasters in other areas of there are a lot of homes that were built from 1995 on in this country that will be falling to bits very soon. And it'll be your job as the students to figure out what to do, how to replace those. You're inheriting a mess, but you're also inheriting a great opportunity to build a lot better than what came before. And I just hope that we can find ways of doing it that knit together a little bit better than some of the pieces that we have been doing. I'm going to finish today with two images of what is on my desk currently that I'm working on, and this is a series of modular homes. And it's this idea of play and plug that I was talking about with, building on, the one house that had the multiple plans and the multiple elevations. These are modular houses. They're not necessarily affordable, but they're not, if you want a cheaper house, you can find a cheaper house somewhere else. But they're the most economical house that we think you can get. Because they're going to be efficient, and they're going to live really well. And we're using, there's a little hard to see the color coding, but the back of this house and the back of this house, the front of this house and the front of this house, this is actually sort of three houses knit together. Actually, it's two houses knit together into four by the time we adjust and switch around, which gives an economy of scale, because they're all going to be modular, they're all going to be built in a factory. But at the same time, it gives variety. So we're able to reach out to a larger number of people within the economies and the available resources that we have. And the front elevations will be each of them will have 3 different elevations and several floor plan options. So we get this play and plug within a set detail. So all of the windows are the same, all of the detailing is the same, the eaves will be consistent. So we'll be able to build them quickly and build them efficiently, but also build them in a way that they'll be solid and hopefully offer a large variety with them. And in the end, really be fabric buildings, because we're not every building doesn't have to be the center of attention, but great places are built when you have simple buildings that line up and contribute to a greater whole. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer the questions.